The child's crying had shifted into something different. Gone was the loud, angry wailing. What remained was thin and faint, like a sound that was already slipping away. Martha Caldwell laid her palm flat against her daughter's belly and felt ribs where there should have been soft, healthy flesh. 5 full days had passed without real food. 5 long nights spent counting each small breath instead of watching the hours go by. The room carried the smell of cold ash and quiet dread. Out in the town, life was moving along as usual. But inside these walls, her little girl was disappearing. When the crying stopped altogether, Martha felt a terror sharper and more cutting than any hunger she'd ever known. Silence like that was dangerous. It was the kind of quiet that didn't come back from. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders, already knowing what she had to do. The very thing she had sworn to herself she never would. And when she finally stepped out into the street, she had no way of knowing that a single voice was about to cut through the noise of the crowd and change the course of everything. The winter of 1886 had its claws deep in the mining town of Red Hollow, holding on like something alive and hungry. Snow had packed itself hard between the buildings. Wind moved through the alleyways like the blade of a knife. Martha knew that cold well by now. It had taken up permanent residence in her bones, much like grief had. Her husband, Daniel Caldwell, had been in the ground for 7 months. A tunnel had collapsed on him, and the company that owned the mine had handed her $10 and a few hollow words of prayer. The money didn't last long, and neither did the kindness of those around her. Neighbors who had once shared bread now found reasons to cross to the other side of the street rather than meet her eyes. Back in the shack she called home, little Annie lay bundled in rags and whatever hope Martha had left. 5 years old, burning with fever, too exhausted even to cry anymore. Martha stood at a cracked piece of mirror and tried to make herself look presentable. Her hand trembled so badly that she pricked her finger twice trying to pin her hair. Blood welled up in small drops. She didn't bother wiping it away. "Mama," Annie's voice floated over from the cot, barely more than a breath. "My tummy hurts." Martha crossed the room and dropped to her knees beside her daughter, pressing a kiss to that small, burning forehead. "I know, baby. Mama's going to get you something to eat today. I promise." Annie nodded, her trust in her mother complete and unconditional. That trust was harder to bear than the hunger itself. In the corner of the room sat a tin cup, their savings. Martha tipped it over and poured the contents into her palm. 7 cents. She closed her fist around the coins as if the warmth of her hand might somehow multiply them. Then she looked once more at Annie, too still, too pale against the rags, and she opened the door. The street was buzzing with miners and their wives, and judgment seemed to follow Martha's every step. Whispers trailed after the sound of her boots. Murdoch's general store stood bright and well-stocked right in the heart of town. Martha paused with her hand on the door handle, her heart hammering. 7 cents wasn't enough to buy mercy. It wasn't enough to buy bread. But it was the only thing standing between her child and the worst possible outcome. She stepped inside. The bell above the door rang out with a cheerfulness that felt entirely wrong for the moment. When Martha Caldwell walked through the door of Murdoch's general store, every head in the room turned toward her. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. The warmth of the place seemed to drain away, as though someone had thrown open a window to let in the winter cold. Behind the counter stood Hester Murdoch, apron perfectly pressed, spine perfectly straight, eyes perfectly sharp with disapproval. She looked at Martha the way a person looks at a stain that simply refuses to come out. "Mrs. Caldwell," Hester said, her voice cool and clipped, "we don't extend credit here. I'm not asking for credit." Martha opened her fist. 7 dull coins caught the glow of the lamplight. "This is all I have." A low murmur moved through the store. Somewhere in the back, someone let out a short, cruel laugh. 7 cents. Hester's mouth tightened into a thin line. "That won't buy you a loaf." "Then a piece of one," Martha said. Her voice shook in spite of everything she did to hold it steady. "My daughter hasn't eaten in days. She's sick. Please." Silence pressed in from all sides. The women standing near the shelves clutched their baskets a little closer. The men looked away, suddenly interested in the floor. From somewhere near the back of the store came a voice, refined and sweet with an edge of poison underneath. "Begging again, are we?" It was Lillian Whitcomb, the mayor's wife, her velvet coat gleaming as she stepped forward. "There's real shame in parading your misery around like this, Mrs. Caldwell." Martha's chest tightened with heat. "I'm trying to keep my child alive." "And not succeeding by the looks of it," Lillian replied, her tone almost gentle. "Perhaps that ought to tell you something." Before Martha could find words to answer, the door swung open and heavy boots sounded on the floor. Sheriff Roland Pike filled the doorframe, broad, stone-faced, his badge catching the light. His presence alone was enough to freeze the room. "You're causing a disturbance," he said, looking directly at Martha. "I'm buying food," she whispered. "With 7 cents. His lip curled. "I've been getting reports. A child crying through the night after night. A mother who can't provide for her own." Ice moved through Martha's veins. "I am providing. I'm trying." "You've got 3 days," Pike said, his voice flat and final. 3 days to prove you can properly care for that child. After that, she'll be placed somewhere more suitable." Martha swayed on her feet. "You can't take her." "I can," he replied, "and I will." Her fingers went slack. The coins scattered and rolled across the wooden floor, each one landing like a tiny verdict. Martha dropped to her knees and scrambled to gather them, her cheeks burning, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. Then the door opened again. Cold air rushed in, but so did a different kind of silence. Not the judging kind, the waiting kind. Martha looked up and at first saw only a pair of travel-worn boots. They stopped directly in front of her, steady and unhurried. A large hand reached down and picked up the last coin, the one that had rolled all the way under the counter. The man held it out toward her. When she lifted her eyes to his face, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. He was tall enough to block out the light behind him, broad through the shoulders, wearing a weathered coat. His face had been shaped by wind, and by years that hadn't been particularly forgiving. A pale scar cut through one eyebrow, and his eyes, steel gray and completely steady, rested on Martha as though he could see straight through the fear she wore like a second skin. "Here," he said quietly, and placed the penny back into her shaking hand. "Thank you," she breathed, barely able to get the words out. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he turned and faced the counter. "I need supplies," he said. Hester Murdoch blinked, momentarily flustered. "Of course, Mr. Hale. What will you be needing?" Martha went rigid. She knew that name. Everyone in Red Hollow knew that name. Jonah Hale, the rancher from the High Valley, the man who rode into town twice a year and kept conversation to a bare minimum, the man who had lost his entire family in a fire and never rebuilt anything more than his fences. "I need bread," Hale said. 5 loaves. Milk, eggs, butter, oats, medicine for a fever. And warm clothing, child-sized, for a girl around 5 or 6 years old. Martha's heart lurched in her chest. She stared at him, too confused and too afraid to let herself hope. Hester hesitated. "That'll come to quite a sum." "I don't care." Hale laid a thick roll of bills on the counter. "Move." The shelves emptied quickly after that. Nobody said a word. Even Sheriff Pike stood frozen in place, his hand hovering near his belt, without quite knowing what to do with itself. When the crates were packed and ready, Hale turned back to Martha. "Where's your daughter?" "At home," she said, her voice beginning to break. "She's very sick." "How long since she last ate?" 5 days. Something dark moved across his face. Old pain, the kind that had been lived with long enough to leave marks. He nodded once. "Can you carry a crate?" She nodded. "Then we're leaving," he said. "What about the sheriff?" she whispered. Hale turned and looked at Pike. His voice stayed calm, but there was iron running through every word. "You're done here." Pike opened his mouth, then closed it again without making a sound. Outside, the cold hit hard, but Martha barely registered it. They walked through town together, people stopping to stare as Jonah Hale carried more than one heavy crate, as though the weight meant nothing at all. At the shack, Martha dropped her crate and rushed inside. "Annie!" Her daughter's eyes fluttered open. "Mama, I'm here, baby, I'm here." Hale came in behind her, knelt down beside the small cot, and pressed the back of his hand to the girl's forehead with a careful, practiced touch. "Fever," he murmured. He mixed medicine into something warm and helped Annie sip it slowly. "Easy now. You're safe." Those 2 words hit Martha like a prayer she hadn't known she needed. He unpacked blankets next, thick, real ones, nothing like the rags the child had been wrapped in, and tucked them around her small body with a tenderness that broke something open inside Martha's chest. "These belong to my daughter," he said quietly. "Feels right that they're being used." Tears ran down Martha's face. "Why are you helping us?" Hale stood slowly. "Because I know that sound," he said. "A child crying when no one comes." He met her eyes. "And because no child should be left to starve while a whole town stands by and looks away." The stove crackled to life for the first time in weeks. Martha stirred thin oats into warm milk, her hands steady for the first time in days, following Jonah Hale's quiet, even instructions. Small spoonfuls. Slow. Let the stomach remember how to work again. Annie swallowed each bite as though it mattered, which it did, more than words could hold. When the child finally drifted off into sleep, a faint color beginning to return to her cheeks, Jonah turned his attention to Martha. "Now you," he said. "I'm fine," she answered automatically. "You're not," he replied. "Not unkindly. Just certain." He set bread and cheese in front of her. "Eat." She did. Carefully at first, then with a need she no longer had the strength to hide. Tears slid quietly down her face as her body began to remember what it felt like to have something in it. Jonah sat nearby without comment, his eyes resting on the fire. When she finished, he stood. "You'll need more than this," he said. "Food runs out. Winter doesn't." "I don't know how to repay you," Martha whispered. "You don't," he answered. "This isn't a debt." She hesitated, then let the question that had been burning in her chest come out. "What happens when the town comes back around?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "They won't." "And if the sheriff—" "He won't," Jonah said again. "Not if he knows what's good for him." A silence settled over the room, warm and strange. Outside, the wind was still howling, but inside the shack, something had shifted. It felt alive now. Jonah reached into one of the crates and lifted out a small wool coat, then a dress. Martha could see the care that had been put into every stitch. "They were my daughters," he said quietly. "She was about Annie's age." "I'm so sorry," Martha breathed. "So am I." He cleared his throat. "You and the girl can't stay here." Fear flared up immediately. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "I know." He met her eyes directly. "That's why you'll come to the ranch. There's plenty of room. You'll earn your keep. No charity involved." The offer hung heavy in the air between them. "What will people say?" Martha asked. The corner of Jonah's mouth curved just slightly. "Whatever they want. They already do." She looked over at Annie, sleeping peacefully under borrowed warmth. Thought about the store, the coins on the floor, the flat certainty in the sheriff's voice. "When?" she asked. "Now," he said, "before anyone has a chance to change their mind." Martha swallowed hard. Leaving meant leaving Daniel's grave behind. Leaving behind everything that was familiar, everything that still smelled like the life she'd had. Staying meant risking everything all over again. She nodded once. By dusk, Annie was bundled up and carried gently into Jonah's wagon. Martha climbed up beside him, her heart pounding as Red Hollow fell away behind them. The mountains rose ahead, dark, vast, and utterly unforgiving. Jonah flicked the reins. "It won't be easy," he said. Martha stared straight ahead, gripping her shawl with both hands. Nothing ever is. The wagon rolled forward, carrying them toward something neither of them could fully see yet. The ranch came into view just as the last of the daylight began to fade. It sat nestled in the high valley, quiet and solid, framed on all sides by dark pines and rising stone. Smoke curled patiently from the chimney. A barn stood a short distance off, weathered but plainly strong. To Martha, it looked like safety made real and visible. Jonah brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down, lifting Annie into his arms with practiced care. "Easy now," he murmured to the sleeping child. "We're home. Home." The words struck Martha somewhere deeper than she'd expected. Inside, the house was simple but warm. A wide hearth, a real table, windows that let the last of the day's light spill gold across the floor. Jonah carried Annie upstairs to a bright room at the far end of the hall. "This one gets the morning sun," he said. "Warmest room in the house." He set Annie down on a small bed that was already made up and waiting. Martha's breath caught. The quilt on it was carefully stitched, clearly loved. "My daughter's room," Jonah said softly. "It should be used." Martha nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Downstairs, Jonah showed her the pump, the pantry, the stove. "There's work to be done," he said, "but no one will go hungry here." That night, after Annie slept peacefully for the first time in what felt like forever, Martha sat at the table while Jonah poured 2 cups of coffee. "You don't have to stay here forever," he said. "If you want to leave when she's strong again, I'll make sure you get wherever you're going safely." She studied his face, the scars, the tired eyes, the tenderness he worked so hard to keep out of sight. "And if I want to stay?" she asked. "Then you stay." The days that followed passed quietly. Annie's strength came back little by little. Color returned. Laughter followed close behind. The ranch filled with small sounds that Jonah hadn't heard in years. On the 3rd morning, a knock landed at the door. Martha's chest clenched tight. Jonah opened it to find Sheriff Pike standing stiffly in the yard, his hat in his hands. "I'm here about the child," he said. "She's fine," Jonah replied, his voice level. "Fed, warm, cared for." Pike shifted his weight. "There's been a misunderstanding. Is that so?" "Yes," Pike said, and the word came out quickly. "No further action will be taken." Jonah held his gaze until the sheriff found somewhere else to look. That night, stars burned bright and thick above the valley. Martha sat out on the porch with Annie curled warm in her lap. "Papa Jonah," the girl murmured, already more than half asleep, her voice full of a certainty she hadn't needed to think about. Jonah paused in the doorway. Then, slowly, he smiled. Just a little. Martha watched the mountain stand its quiet guard over the valley and felt something new settle itself inside her chest. Not relief exactly. Something more permanent than that. Belonging. The letter arrived 3 weeks later with the afternoon mail, handed over by a ranch hand who couldn't quite bring himself to look Jonah in the eye. Jonah read it once, then read it again. When he looked up, his face had gone still, in a way that Martha had already learned to be wary of. "What is it?" she asked. He folded the paper with slow, deliberate care. Too deliberate. Someone's filed a claim against the ranch. Her stomach dropped. "A claim?" "Says the land deed is invalid," he said. "Railroad expansion. A survey error. They want me in Denver to contest it, or lose everything." Martha knew without needing to be told. "It's him." Jonah nodded once. "Your husband's brother." That night, Annie slept between them on the wide bed that Jonah had finally agreed to share. The child's hand had curled itself into the front of his shirt as naturally as breathing. "I don't want you to go," Annie whispered. "I'll come back," Jonah said softly. "That's what Papa Daniel said," she replied. "Before the mine." The words settled heavily over all 3 of them. Jonah swallowed hard. "I promise you," he said, his voice thick but steady. "I will come back." Martha watched him in the dim light, and saw the fear behind the strength he carried. Leaving meant walking into a fight against money and power he didn't have on his side. Staying meant losing everything regardless. "We go together," she said. "No," Jonah replied, instantly and firmly. "It's dangerous." "So is letting him win," she said quietly. "We're a family now. Families don't split apart when things get hard." Annie nodded with absolute conviction. Families stay together. Jonah closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the decision had already been made. "Together," he said. Denver was loud and sharp and overwhelming. Too many people, too many watching eyes, too many men who had decided long ago that the world bent itself to accommodate them. They checked into a modest hotel, and, while Annie colored pictures on the bed in their room, Jonah and Martha made their way down to the public records office and spread out old ledgers across dusty tables. Truth, hidden in plain sight. Martha found it first. "Jonah," she whispered, pressing her finger to the page. "These numbers don't match." His eyes moved quickly across the columns. His jaw clenched. He's been stealing for years. The realization burned through both of them, clean and cold and clarifying. The man who was trying to take their home had built everything he had on rot and theft. They didn't go to the sheriff. They didn't go to the courthouse. They went directly to him. Robert Caldwell sat behind a polished desk, his confidence visibly cracking at the edges as papers slid across his blotter toward him. "You're going to withdraw the claim," Martha said, her voice completely calm. "And then you're going to disappear from our lives." "And if you don't," Jonah said quietly, "then everyone learns exactly what you are." Silence stretched out between them. By morning, the claim had been withdrawn. The deed stood firm. That night, back in the hotel room, Jonah held Martha as though he was afraid she might simply vanish if he loosened his grip. "You saved us," he said. She shook her head. "We saved each other." And for the first time, the future didn't feel like something coming to take everything away. The ride home from Denver felt longer than the journey there, but lighter in every way that mattered. Annie pressed her face to the side of the wagon, naming clouds and birds, pausing only to laugh when Jonah pointed out a hawk circling high overhead. Martha watched the two of them together, the easy, natural way his voice softened when he spoke to the child, the way Annie leaned toward him without even thinking about it. It still surprised her sometimes, how quickly something so fragile had begun to feel so real. They reached the valley near sunset. The house was waiting exactly as it always had, smoke rising steady and patient from the chimney. Jonah slowed the team and let the wagon roll to a stop. "Home," Annie said, with total certainty. Inside, the familiar sounds wrapped around them like something warm. The pop and hiss of the fire, the creak of the floorboards, the wind brushing softly against the eaves. Jonah set the kettle on. Martha unpacked their small travel bag. Ordinary motions, anchors. That night, after Annie drifted off to sleep with her cheek resting on Jonah's arm, Martha lay awake listening to his breathing. It caught once, then evened out. "Are you all right?" she whispered. He nodded in the dark. "I keep thinking it'll be taken away. Like if I relax my guard for even a moment, it'll all vanish." She reached for his hand. "It won't. We fought for this." A silence followed, and then, quieter still. "I don't know how to do this," Jonah said, "not without thinking of what I lost." Martha squeezed his fingers. "We're not replacing them. We're just making room." He turned toward her, eyes catching the faint glow of the firelight. "I want to try," he said. "Really try. Not just for Annie's sake." Her heart beat hard and steady. "So do I." Morning came with chores and sunlight. Annie chased the barn cat through the yard. Jonah repaired a bench. Martha baked bread and ended up with flour on her cheek, which surprised a laugh out of her when Jonah pointed it out with a teasing look. A week passed. Then another. One night, a nightmare yanked Jonah out of sleep. He sat bolt upright, breathing ragged, hands shaking. Before he could pull himself away into the familiar isolation, Martha was there, arms around him, steady as stone. "I'm here," she said simply. "You're not alone." He leaned into her. The fight went out of him by degrees. When his breathing finally slowed, he didn't move away. They didn't speak about love. Not yet. They talked about the weather, about fence lines, about getting Annie enrolled in school come spring. But something quiet was growing between them anyway, built out of nights they'd faced side by side and mornings they had chosen again and again. One evening on the porch, Annie climbed into Jonah's lap and reached up to trace the scar that cut through his eyebrow with one small, careful finger. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "Not much," he said. "Good," Annie replied, satisfied with the answer. "You're safe now." Jonah looked over the top of the child's head at Martha. In his eyes she saw it clearly. Gratitude, wonder, and the beginning of a promise forming. The stars came out one by one, and for the first time, peace settled in and stayed. Autumn moved into the valley slowly, as though it was testing whether it was welcome. The mornings turned crisp. Frost appeared along the edges of the grass. Annie ran laughing through drifts of fallen leaves, her voice ringing across the yard. Stronger now, fuller, more like herself than Martha had ever heard her. Martha watched from the porch, a warm cup between both hands, feeling a quiet disbelief that this was her life now. Jonah stood nearby, mending tack, glancing up every few moments to check on Annie without realizing he was doing it. That was what struck Martha most. He was already a father. He'd been one for a while now. He just hadn't noticed yet. One afternoon, a neighbor rode up the drive, a cautious, polite man who spoke of cattle prices and the weather, then let his gaze drift toward the house. "Good to see the place lively again," he said. "It's been a long while." Jonah nodded. Long enough. After the rider left, Jonah stood quiet for a moment. "They'll talk," Martha said gently. "About us. Let them," he replied. That night, after Annie had fallen asleep, clutching the little carved wooden horse Jonah had made for her, Martha sat down beside him at the table. "I won't stay if it causes trouble for you," she said. "If people start making things difficult—" Jonah shook his head. "You and Annie are not trouble. You're the best thing that's happened on this ranch since the fire." The words sat between them. "I still see them," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "My wife, my little girl. Sometimes I could swear I hear them." Martha didn't look away. "I still talk to Daniel when the nights run long." Something in Jonah's shoulders released. "Then we understand each other." He reached for her hand. This time she didn't hesitate to give it. Winter hinted at itself early that year. One evening, when snow had already dusted the peaks, Jonah brought in extra loads of wood and then paused in the doorway, watching Martha braid Annie's hair by the fire. "You don't have to stay up here forever," he said. "When spring comes, you could go back to town. Start fresh." Martha looked around the room, the warmth, the quiet, the child who had nearly been lost now humming softly under her hands. "This is starting fresh," she said. He studied her face for a long moment, as if looking for something. "And if I asked you to stay," he said. Her heart beat hard. "Then I would." He nodded once, like a man accepting a truth he'd been sitting with for a while. Later that night, Jonah lay beside her, careful as glass, as if afraid that too much movement might shatter something precious and new. "Martha," he said softly into the dark. "I'm scared. So am I." Silence wrapped around them both. Then his hand found hers. The fear didn't leave, but it stopped being something either of them had to carry alone. The first real snow came in hard and fast, burying the valley overnight, sealing the ranch off from the rest of the world in a silence that felt both protective and precarious. Jonah was up before dawn to check on the cattle, pulling on his coat while Martha coaxed the fire back to life. "Don't go too far," she said. He smiled faintly. "I won't." But the hours passed. The sun climbed and then disappeared behind heavy clouds. Annie sat by the window, worry beginning to work its way into her expression. "Papa's late," she said quietly. Martha told herself not to panic. Work always ran long in winter weather. Still, she laced up her boots and wrapped her shawl tight, leaving Annie by the fire with firm instructions not to move, and followed Jonah's footprints toward the upper pasture. Snow swallowed sound. Wind cut straight through her layers. She found him near the fence line, one leg twisted beneath him at a wrong angle, blood dark and spreading against the white. "Jonah." She dropped to her knees, hands shaking. "I slipped," he said through teeth clenched against the pain. Ice under the snow. Even now, even like this, his first glance was toward the house. "Annie, she's safe," Martha said. "I've got you." And she did. Somehow. With rope and sheer stubbornness and breath fogging thick in the cold air, she got him onto the sled and hauled him home inch by inch across that silent, frozen ground. By nightfall, Jonah was by the fire, his leg bound tight, fever climbing. Martha worked without stopping. Cool cloths, water, quiet reassurances said close to his ear. Annie sat nearby, silent and fierce and watchful. "You're not allowed to die," the girl said finally with complete seriousness. "We already lost one papa." Jonah's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. "I'll do my best." The fever broke the following morning. The days that came after were slow and still. Jonah couldn't ride. He couldn't work. Martha stepped into the gap without fanfare, feeding the stock, splitting wood, hauling water from the pump. Her hands blistered. Her back ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. But she didn't waver. Not once. One night Jonah lay watching her from across the room, and his eyes were bright with something that wasn't fever. "You saved me," he said. She shrugged, bone-tired but steady. "That's what family does." He reached for her hand and held it without letting go. When enough snow had melted for the road to open again, Jonah stood on crutches in the doorway, watching Annie chase the chickens around the yard in the pale winter light. "I'm done pretending," he said quietly. Martha looked over at him. "I love you." The words didn't frighten her, not even a little. "I love you too," she answered. They didn't rush anything after that. There were no grand declarations or sweeping promises. But when Jonah kissed her, gently, surely, as something chosen rather than fallen into, it felt like something that had been incomplete for a long time had finally come full circle. Outside, the valley waited, and this time they were ready to meet it. Spring arrived quietly, almost shy after everything the long winter had asked of them. Snow retreated from the valley in patches. The creek ran high and cold with meltwater. Green pushed up through brown earth in small, insistent patches, like promises being kept. Jonah walked without the crutches now, though he still favored the injured leg when he thought no one was paying attention. Martha noticed. So did Annie. "You're limping," the girl announced one morning, hands planted firmly on her hips. Jonah smiled. "Only a little." "You should rest," Annie said, with great authority. "Mama says resting is how things heal." Martha kept her smile hidden behind her cup. Life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Martha ran the household with quiet competence. Jonah took on work again, slower than before, and wiser for it. Annie learned her letters at the kitchen table and read them aloud each evening, as if each one was a small treasure to be presented. The past didn't disappear. It just softened. One afternoon, a rider appeared at the edge of the drive. Martha's chest tightened until she recognized him. A county clerk, someone she'd seen in Denver. He carried official papers. Jonah read them slowly, then passed them to Martha. "Deeds reaffirmed," he said. "Final. No future claims." Martha let out a breath she realized she'd been holding for months. That evening, Jonah took her hand on the porch. "I should have asked you properly," he said. She tilted her head. "Asked me what?" "To stay. To build this with me. To be my wife." Her heart skipped. Not from fear, but from a deep, clear recognition. "I already am," she said softly. I know, he replied, but I want you to choose it again, freely, without any fear driving the decision. She looked at the house, at Annie asleep inside, at the man who had carried her child out of starvation and into life. I choose you, she said. They were married quietly the following Sunday. No town, no crowd, no audience. Just a judge, a single witness, and Annie standing between them with both their hands held in hers. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Annie's grin was wide enough to fill the whole room, like she'd won something she'd been working toward all along. That night, the house felt different, warmer, whole in a way it hadn't quite been before. Jonah lay awake beside Martha, his fingers tracing slow, absent circles on the back of her hand. I used to think love had to be loud, he said, burning, consuming. And now? Now I know it can be steady, chosen over and over again. Martha turned toward him and rested her head against his chest. That kind lasts, she said. Outside, the valley breathed in the summer dark. Inside, a family held fast to one another. Summer came in strong and bright, filling the valley with sound. The grass grew high along the fence lines. The creek ran clear and fast. Annie's laughter followed Jonah wherever he went, and he pretended poorly not to notice how often her small hand found its way into his. When she thought no one was watching, Martha noticed everything. One morning, while hanging laundry in the warm breeze, she felt it again. The quiet heaviness, the low and certain knowledge she'd been carefully avoiding for days. She stood very still for a moment, one hand on the clothesline, the other pressed flat against her stomach. When Jonah came inside for water, she met him at the door. Jonah, she said softly, we need to talk. He looked at her face and went completely still. What's wrong? Nothing, she said. Then she smiled through the tears, already rising. Everything. It took him a moment to understand. When it landed, he sat down hard on the bench beside the door, like the air had gone out of him all at once. You sure? He asked, his voice rough at the edges. She nodded. He covered his face with both hands. When he looked up, his eyes were wet and shining. After the fire, he said quietly, I thought that part of my life was simply gone, that I'd never... It's not replacing anything, Martha said. She knelt down in front of him. It's something entirely new. That night, they told Annie. The girl stared at them in complete silence. Then she pulled in a breath so sharp that Martha reached for her in alarm. A baby? Annie whispered. Jonah nodded. If all goes well. Annie launched herself straight into Martha's lap and wrapped her arms around her with all the strength she had. I'll help, she announced, with the full weight of serious intention behind it. I'll be the very best helper there is. Joy moved through the house that evening, deep and real. But peace had never been content to stay undisturbed for long. 2 weeks later, a stranger rode into the valley, well-dressed, too clean, carrying a smile that was polite in the way that concealed things. He asked questions about cattle shipments and rail schedules. Jonah answered carefully. Martha watched from the porch, unease moving under her skin. That night, Jonah stood at the window staring out at the dark hills. It's not over, he said quietly. What isn't? Men like Robert don't forget. They wait. They find other angles. Martha came and stood beside him, resting her head against his arm. Then we'll face it like we always do. Jonah nodded, but his eyes stayed on the darkness beyond the glass. Inside, Annie slept with her wooden horse tucked under one arm. The house was full. The future was real. And somewhere out beyond the hills, something was stirring. The stranger never came back. Days passed, then weeks. Summer rolled on in its generous, unhurried way, and the valley gave back what it had once threatened to take. Jonah kept watch, but he refused to let fear be the thing that ran the house. Martha moved through her days steadily and carefully, listening to her body, protecting the small life growing inside her. Annie changed too. She grew gentler, more thoughtful, more deliberate. When she thought no one could hear her, she whispered to Martha's stomach, plans and promises and quiet assurances. Jonah watched her with a heart so full it occasionally surprised him. He hadn't just been chosen by this family, he had been trusted by them. That was something different altogether. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the hills in shades of copper and gold, Annie stood between them on the porch. "Families don't leave," she said, with the absolute certainty of someone stating a fundamental law of the universe. "They stay." Jonah crouched down and pulled her close. "That's right." Martha looked at the two of them, both of them broken, in their own different ways, and both of them somehow finding their way through because of each other, and because of the small, fierce, certain child between them. That night, Jonah placed his hand over Martha's stomach. Careful, reverent, like he was holding something he finally understood the value of. "I won't fail them," he said quietly. "Any of them." She covered his hand with hers. "You already haven't." When autumn came around again, it didn't bring fear with it. It brought apples on the table and wood stacked high against the wall and laughter moving through rooms that had once known only silence. The past stayed where it belonged, not erased, not forgotten, but carried gently and honored in the way it deserved. Sometimes in quiet moments, Martha's thoughts drifted back to the store, to the coins, to the hard cold floor beneath her knees. She remembered the exact moment she had been on the edge of losing everything, and she remembered the hand that had reached down to her. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would speak about Jonah Hale's ranch. They'd say it was a place where children were kept safe, where the door stayed open, where love didn't make a lot of noise but held on through everything. They wouldn't know what it had cost, but Martha would. On a quiet evening, with Annie reading aloud at the table and Jonah rocking the baby beside the fire, Martha closed her eyes and breathed in the sound of it. All of it. Some things are worth surviving for. Some things are worth choosing again and again, every single day.